London Reels, Way Better Idea, sponsored by Xbrain. Every day I come into the studio, there's literally a million things to do. Whether it's booking a guest, taping a show, editing an episode, or trying to pitch that future sponsor. It's hard to know where to begin. So I took a tip from Martin Bjerregaard, our former guest, and I create a today list. It's not a to-do list, but it's those 3 things that you want to get done today. The ones you've been putting off, the phone calls you know you have to make. I focus on those, and I usually find I have a productive one. I hope that works for you. Today's Way Better Idea is brought to you by the guys at Xbrain. If you want to check out their grass-fed, free-range protein powder, you can go to xbrain.co.uk or click on the link below and get 15% off. Use the code LondonReal. Peace! Thank you for coming back to the UK, and Jared, welcome to London Real.
It's always a pleasure to be back in the UK and in London in particular.
You know, I wanted to ask you that before we dive into your literary works. You were in Cambridge in 61, is that right?
I was here 58 to 62.
Wow. Okay, that's quite some time ago, before I was born. And what was that experience like? Were you itching to get to England, or was it kind of a cultural shift? You were coming from Boston at the time, is that right?
Yes, I was born and grew up in Boston. I spent my life in Boston, so I was ready to go somewhere else, preferably as far as possible, but no other planet was available. And Cambridge was world leading at that time in physiology, the discipline I wanted to study, and also Britain, in addition to its other virtues. Cambridge is close to London, which has wonderful music and theater, and Britain is close to the continent, which has all those other interesting people.
Wow. And so what was it like when you were here? What do you remember most from 58 to 62? Interesting times.
They were interesting times, and in retrospect, in fact, this is going to be the subject of my next book. 58 to 62, in retrospect, was a key time in British history when Britain was going through a painful transition of dismantling the empire, losing Britain's traditional identity of the empire in which the world never set, the most powerful fleet, the biggest economy. Britain was having to find a new identity and was struggling at the time. And Britain was poorer, was dismantling the fleet, had its first race riots. So it was an interesting and, I'd say, tumultuous time in Britain then.
I've been reading a biography listening actually via audiobook from Keith Richards from the Rolling Stones, and he's kind of walking you through British history, late 50s, early 60s. And I think we forget how war-torn this country was and how much of a hangover, you could say, that World War II was. And he was saying there were more horse-drawn vehicles after the Second War than there was after the First War in central London. And like I said, I think that was a huge transition time that people forget about England. So.
My first visit to the UK, in fact, was in 1950 when I was 12 years old. And at that time, there was still food rationing. There were still lots of bombed out sites in London that had not been rebuilt. Friends of my parents whom we visited, although they were a distinguished scientist couple, were living in a house without electricity, with a wooden table lit by candles, not elegant Victorian candles, but rough peasants' candles, and dinner was corn mush because they didn't have anything better to eat. This was Britain 5 years after the war.
Wow, that must have been amazing to see. So you made your trips over to Papua New Guinea after you finished at Cambridge, is that right?
That's right. My first PNG trip was 1964, after I got my PhD and after I had returned to the US.
This week on London Real, former MI5 intelligence officer turned whistleblower, Annie Machon.
What we're looking at now is a de facto police state. You know, all the laws are in place, they're just not being applied to most citizens yet. I think it's not a case of having anything to hide. It's having a case that I have a right to privacy, and I can't guarantee my government will uphold that right, therefore I need to take the steps to do it.
She talks NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden.
He would die for his country. He wants to try and improve the way his country operates within its own boundaries and protect its citizens. And we seem to forget and think that human rights are a luxury. They're not, they're fundamental, and privacy is one of them.
On Sunday, London Reel presents Annie Michon, Whistleblower.
So it's a very British mess, is the short answer.